So now that I've finished my FMP completely, sketchbook and final piece wise, I wanted to do a final evaluation in the style of a vlog, just so that it's easier to kind of portray exactly what I was thinking throughout the entire project and I can explain it more in depth. So context wise, I started off with a few of the group workshops that we had right at the beginning of the project. I actually missed this specific one because of troubles getting into the college, but I caught up on it at home, and that was just a newspaper report finding specific ones that took interest in me, and then I did a few mind maps and highlighted specific words that I liked. So some particular ones I chose was like exposure and depression, but then I also juxtaposed that with colour and vibrancy. In the past I've done a lot of projects that are based around quite morbid subjects, so I wanted to at least start the project with the colour and vibrancy one. So that's what then led me on to the next group project or group workshop, and that was to collage and put into the gallery different sources of inspiration on the walls and going from there. So I started off with a collage of just colourful things. I found these in just various magazines that we had in the art studio, and I just wrote some little notes like colour and vibrancy and texture, and that ends up being quite important later on in the project, the whole idea of texture. And then I then went on to putting that into the art gallery. So we put these on the wall and then made post-it notes of everyone's work and like things that jumped out to us. And the one that I actually liked was on my own collage, and that reminded me of like surface texture and manipulating a surface. And I did some research into this artist, which I believe is Victoria Villasana, and she did weaving and crocheting stuff on top of photographs. So I liked that a lot, and then did my own response to that, where I used just wool to kind of do a triangular shape because that's one of the main shapes that I kind of looked into, and I did some little like samples and things like that. From there I then realised that I liked the whole idea of weaving and how it intertwines on here. This is continuous line triangles, and it kind of reminded me of like a weave, and it says here like intertwining and knitting. So then I attempted my first ever crochet, and it came out quite abstract, which at the time I thought I'd just throw away, but I actually really like it, and it reminded me of like netting, which then kind of went on to the idea of being trapped and conservation, and then SeaWorld issues. I've always been quite passionate about the issues at SeaWorld, so to be able to put my entire FMP into it was quite cool because it meant that I had a lot of knowledge already on it, but I could really show it off. We then related it back with just some mind maps. I wanted to talk about the animal behaviour since being in captivity, you know, the behavioural changes and their health and what happens and how they're trapped and things like that. So I went on to originally just building the context of it, not straight away going into SeaWorld, and I took a trip to Colchester Zoo and just took some pictures of the other captive animals in Colchester Zoo, mainly water ones because I did want it to be water based. So I've just got some various pictures of other penguins and seals and things like that, and took a few notes of things that it could represent. So it's quite a powerful, this one's quite a powerful shot representing like the boredom in captive animals. It just looks quite bored and just swimming around the same area. And how this one shows how they're there purely for entertainment. It's nothing that they want to be in, you know, holding animals in captivity is for the entertainment of us humans. And then went on to the subsequent orca regression, so more so looking into a specific kind of animal, and I wanted to look into orcas in specifically because I knew there was a lot of things going on in SeaWorld surrounding orcas. So I just highlighted some main things, and they get quite aggressive when put in captivity. So I just made some notes saying about like self-harm and aggression, and more specifically I took a really big interest in rake marks. So rake marks are when in captivity the animals get quite aggressive and they attack each other, and that leaves really painful marks on their skin. I think that's quite important because the surface texture on here relates quite closely to beginning contextual research, because relating back to Victoria Villasana, where she's adapting a surface with textures, also relates to my very beginnings when I did the collage and said how I wanted to look into texture. So it's all kind of flowed from that one beginning idea of surface texture. So I then went on to just doing some basic sketching and like making rake marks, highlighting the rake marks on Adobe Illustrator and distressing some fabric just to kind of put forward my initial ideas to the subject. And I also experimented with embossing, and I did that by putting hot glue in a shape that reminded me quite similarly of rake marks and that kind of 3D texture on a surface, and then I embossed that and printed it in black ink, which I think was quite effective because this is actually a mistake. I was just trying to like dry it off and I thought it looked really effective. I then used fabric manipulation to do some slashing samples, and that again I'm just exploring mainly the surface texture with a background thought of how it's rake marks. I wasn't specifically trying to create rake marks, but I was more going into the idea of surface texture. So I've done a slashing sample. I did choose like colours that reminded me of like blood and water, just so it's always relating back to the initial concept, but I was more so going off the idea of creating a lot of surface texture through my samples. And I've done another sample just in plain calico, just so that you can really see the shapes that I've created. And then back to the idea of when I was responding to the Victoria Villasana work, I made a weave and distressed that just to show how you make one solid surface and then destroy it, much like how a whale, when it's in freedom, is a healthy, you know, like animal with a smooth surface, and then put in captivity things can happen and it's destroyed. With some artist research, I looked into just two artists from the Tate that have been exhibited in the Tate, and they're just looking into texture. So I then responded to that in my own kind of way, looking at how a surface has been scratched away, and did a lino print. And I just did that very much based on rake marks, the shapes that I created, and that was my response to these artworks. And again, a mistake, I was just trying to dry off the lino print, but it actually made a really interesting print in general. I took, this probably is going into the research. My most significant piece of primary research was definitely the embryology exhibition at the Tate. I didn't realise it would be so important, but it's actually the ground for all of my research pretty much. So I went to the Tate recently and took pictures of this one huge 3D installation called the Embryology by Magdalena Abakanovic. I can't really say that. And that's basically a massive room with potato sacks that are all filled and stacked on top of each other. I wanted to represent textile pieces that involved texture. So I then got inspired by the idea of using puff binder, because all of the shapes that the puff binder makes, they're never exactly the same. It's a bit like popcorn. You just add the liquid and then apply heat and it puffs up. So I did some that are inspired by like scratching and like rake marks, and that's adding a lot of surface texture, and I really liked how the puff binder works to really create a lot of interesting textiles. Last year I went on a whale watching tour in Monterey Bay in California, and I took some primary images of whales that aren't in captivity, and I wanted to show kind of like the difference in how the animals react to the public, things like that. These animals were really happy, they were surrounding the boat, they looked really just free, and they were moving their tails and putting on a show for us. But obviously they can swim away if they felt frightened. I also asked the marine biologist on the boat how long they're expected to live, and it's a lot longer than when they're kept in captivity. I also just responded to some little like textures that I found on the tail with some textiles. One of the important pieces I found out was that when the whales feel distressed and they get depression in captivity, they get a dorsal fin collapse. So I did a few textile samples which just kind of showed how it collapses and things like that, because that's not something that happens in the wild, so it's quite important to raise awareness of it. And I also then took that into my workshop week and did a tuck and fold sample, which I think quite closely relates to how a dorsal fin can look, how it's all folded up. And again, it's showing surface texture, which I really liked, because although my project started with the idea of whale captivity in the SeaWorld, it then stemmed on to a lot about surface texture. And then I did a rag rugging sample, again just to explain the idea of surface texture. I wanted to experiment with loads of different techniques to do that. The idea of skin and whale skin, I thought it'd be quite sticky, just the way it looks quite rubbery, so I liked the idea of using liquid latex. It wasn't something I'd used before, so I started off using a YouTube tutorial for a Halloween makeup, and I just manipulated that to make my own kind of samples with rake marks. I don't really like how it turned out, but it was interesting to experiment with something I hadn't before. Again, back to puff binder, I wanted to use it on a rougher surface to see how it manipulates that fabric and the surface texture, and I actually think it's really interesting because where all the little bits started to fray, it's clung on to even the tiniest little bits, and again I thought that related quite closely to the images I took on the whale watching tour. Because I'm a fashion and textile student, I just wanted to see how it could manipulate a surface on clothing. So I took some cutouts from Vogue and then added puff binder onto it to see how it could manipulate a surface. And then from the previous embryology exhibition, I liked the idea of like circles and all like the layers. So I added a few freehand embroidery samples. That's usually one of my stronger points, is freehand embroidery, so I knew I wanted to put it in somewhere. So I did one of rake marks and then one using that idea of circles linking together and, you know, making a cool texture. And then to add a bit more 3D, I added some beading because I also thought that kind of looked like the similar textures found on the whales, but in a more aesthetic way. As far as more secondary research goes, I looked into one specific documentary called Blackfish on Netflix. They talk about how the animals are captured and give you more of like the scientific facts. So how the animals turn into being quite dangerous. There was one story about one of the trainers being killed by the orca because it was so angry during a show to the public, and I think that's quite important because the animals are performing for the public and it's forced against their will, and that just shows how they built up anger and the way they're kept. And it also shows in the documentary how the tanks are significantly smaller than even the car parks to the SeaWorld, so it shows quite dramatically how they're kept. I then just did some planning for my final pieces, you know, like the installations and everything like that, and the structures that they're giving us. So it spells out play. So I just did a few like positives, negatives, stuff like that, of reasons why the letters would be good. And then went back onto my project with some mind maps and deciding how I want to, you know, create the textures. Like I said before, I really liked the idea of the circles, so I wanted to take that forward. And I did a little plan for making my own paper. I didn't end up doing that because one of the pieces of equipment was £45. I didn't seem like it was necessarily enough in my project because it wouldn't, you know, make enough texture, and I really wanted to make something 3D. So I kind of just left that as a plan and didn't really go ahead with that. I wanted to add some idiosyncratic research, so I took a primary image of my sister's scarlet fever and kind of illustrated that into a sample, which I then went ahead and made, again using the same technique as before with the freehand embroidery, looking a bit like the circles that I did in the previous sample of this one. So again, I really like that, and I really show an interest in that, this kind of freehand embroidered circular design. And then I related that to an artist called Giuseppe Pannone, and that's all about skin. And I go back to skin a little bit later on in my project. So yeah, I just related that just to kind of add a bit more context, not just focusing on whales. Again with that circular design, because I really liked it, I then went ahead and experimented with freehand embroidery on cling film. I really liked how the cling film worked because it kind of, where it layered up, it kind of made a creased effect, and that kind of reminded me of of rake marks again, and then I used freehand embroidery on top of that. And I spoke about problem solving with this because it was quite difficult, because it's really delicate. And again on this one I used puff binder with the mixtures because I wanted to start incorporating my samples and my techniques all together to kind of go towards a final piece. I then set this in resin because I wanted to experiment with making something so delicate quite structured. I did like that. I didn't end up really going ahead with that idea, but it was good to do it as an experiment. Again, in previous projects I've kind of struggled with planning and problem solving, so I've made sure that on every sample, especially from now on, I've used problem solving and like time plans for each sample, so I know exactly how long it's going to take before I do it, whether it's relevant, and the problems that I might need to solve. One of my most interesting pieces that I tried was quite a long process, but it was to make like a 3D sculpture kind of thing. So I started off with doing a clay structure of just 3D balls, very much inspired by the embryology exhibition where all the sacks are stacked. I kind of went by that kind of impression, and then I vacuum formed that after about 3 days of leaving the clay to set. From the vacuum form I just removed the clay and filled it with resin, and then popped beads in there as well, because I wanted to add a bit of texture, and I knew that because the resin's clear it might be a bit boring, so I added some beading in there as well, and it ended up making this really interesting 3D kind of bobbly textured effect, which I really liked. Again, looking back at freehand embroidery, I did some on calico, this time involving a lot of beading and freehand embroidery and puff binder, as well as experimenting with layering and trying to make it look 3D without being 3D. And I talk about that in my reflective journal, but I also experimented with adding text because I wanted to bring it back, even though my kind of project moved on to being very surface texture related. I wanted to bring it back to raising awareness on the whales. I then again did another plan for some screen printing, and I didn't end up going ahead with, taking it any further than kind of these experiments because it's not as eye-catching as I think the freehand embroidery is, so I didn't take it any further. But it was interesting to experiment with a different technique with the circles, and it made me really realise that I do like the idea of having the circles layered on top of each other. I then just did an initial plan for my final pieces, because the exhibition was coming up at this time, and then did some more secondary research into infections and lesions. I illustrated the rough pattern that I saw on a whale with a lesion in SeaWorld, and then related that to skin problems in humans. So again, like I said before, I went back to skin and took pictures of my own acne, and did a dot to dot to make another pattern, and I thought that was actually quite similar to the lesions anyway. So I quite liked how the primary related quite closely to the secondary. I then used the same idea of where I did the layered circles on freehand embroidery. I then used the new pattern from the spots dot to dot to create this new freehand embroidery piece, and then decided that could be a development from the original design. So I experimented it a bit more on different textures. So I did it on like a rough fabric, a stretchy fabric, cling film, mixture of both, and with the different shapes, and kind of whittled it down to a shape I really liked, and that did end up being just the circles. I then experimented that with layering because I really like the idea of layers. So I kind of mixed media, mixed fabric, and then added a lot more little pieces with words and made one 3D with wadding, just to then bring it back to SeaWorld and just to show how I wanted it to really relate back to it, even though it's all gone into surface texture, why I have done it. I used some primary images from SeaWorld when I went, just to show you know, like that it's not all in the documentaries, and that I have seen it firsthand. And I noticed in one of the pictures that the whale is beginning to get a dorsal fin collapse, especially in this one and this one. You can really see how the fin is starting to collapse. So it kind of proves my research to be correct. I then started to experiment with final pieces and did those resin samples again. I didn't like it though, because it made the paper go a bit transparent and it looked quite dirty and didn't look very clear, or effective. So I decided not to go ahead with resin, but did some plans, again time plans and just general plans for problem solving and things like that for final pieces. My original final pieces were in 4 frames from IKEA, but I ended up changing that because my tutors felt it needed a bit more development, but I just included the plans anyway, just to show how I've gone from one idea to the next. So here I'm at this stage where I've made my final pieces ready for installation tomorrow, and we went back to the idea of the resin in the vacuum form mould. It's still drying, but I'm going to have to hot glue it to an acrylic tray, so that because we're going to put water in there to show context again with the whales, because obviously I'm talking about whale captivity and it's gone on to a lot of surface texture. To mix the context together, I'm going to put it in trays of water, and I think that'll be quite interesting because at first hand the audience isn't really going to know what it's about, but obviously it relates quite strongly to my project. We also decided to scrap the idea of putting words into my final pieces because the textures alone were quite effective, so I've put them onto blocks of wood instead of frames so that the audience could touch them if they want to, but it's also just more obvious as to what I'm talking about. So I've got 4 on calico, and then I've also got some on cling film. And I'm going to be installing that tomorrow. So that's my sketchbook, and then as far as planning and production, like I said, I've done a lot of time plans and I've got my initial big time plan for the entire project, but I think most importantly I have put in for most samples, which isn't something I've usually done, but I've planned how long each sample is going to take. Practical skills, I think I've mixed a lot of media, used a lot of techniques. I've done structure, like sculpture, vacuum forming, which I've never tried before, with fabric manipulation and sewing and things like that. Evaluation and reflection, I've kept an up-to-date reflective journal throughout the project, with evaluations throughout the sketchbook as well, and then I'm going to be using this vlog to clearly talk about my work. Problem solving, again, that's something I've fallen behind on before in projects, so I've made sure that I have involved a lot of problem solving throughout, both in my sketchbook and my reflective journal. And my presentation, I kind of went for the route of keeping it quite clean with a little bit of text in places. Some pages have got more text than others, but it's mainly visual. And that is my FMP. I've named it beaching because that's one of the problems that was occurring in my research that took place. But yeah,